Um, the Dismantling Racism series has been going for quite a few years. It was a monthly event with Rainier Valley Historical Society for a while, and now is a approximately quarterly event. And this is the third in this year. There will also be an event in November, which will be focused on DACA recipients. I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. Maya Manus is the Advocacy and Civic Engagement Coordinator at the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. Her focus is on how to engage the community, registering to vote, completing the census, and how much local legislators and politicians matter. Her focus is on the intersectionality of race, protest, and politics, and how they work in tandem with one another. Maya has been interested in local politics since her undergrad at Washington State University and currently is studying at Seattle University School of Law.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So good evening, everyone. Like Virginia said, I'm Maya Manus, and I work at the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle as the Advocacy and Civic Engagement Coordinator. I wanted to sort of talk about this subject, dismantling racism in voting, and how hard and tricky it is. I want to sort of provide a brief historical synopsis of racism in the voting process and how it is affecting such a crucial election this year, nationally and locally, and how we've always kind of had this back and forth of having the right to vote and then having to fight for the right to vote again. So the clearest example of showing racism in voting and showing the power behind the vote is looking at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and then back again at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The reason why we're going to look at those together is because they're enacted almost 100 years apart, but they're essentially the same thing. And so I want to call out that I didn't learn this connection on my own. I learned this in my undergrad. And this is what sort of inspired me to get into local politics and civic engagement, and actually inspired me to go to law school in the first place. So first, with that being said, I first would like to break down the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And so we know that the 13th Amendment was passed shortly after the Civil War in 1865. It abolishes slavery except as punishment for a crime. And then shortly after, 3 years later, we have the 14th Amendment, which one of the most pivotal of the Reconstruction amendments after the Civil War and ending slavery. And it essentially stated that all persons born here are citizens. And in addition, no state shall make or enforce law, any law that deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and cannot deny any person of equal protection of laws. So essentially, it made sure that those previously enslaved in the United States were citizens, and they ensured that everyone had equal protection of law. This also allowed for state laws to become subject to the Bill of Rights of the Constitution and extended the concept of due process of law to all states. And then finally, the most pivotal is in 1870, there was the 15th Amendment that allowed the right to vote to citizens in the United States, and that cannot be denied on the account of race and color. And so with these three key amendments, those who were previously enslaved were deemed citizen, and men were given the right to vote, and it abolished slavery. And shortly after this, for a brief period, very brief period, called the Reconstruction, it was almost like there was a new United States or a second revolution. Black men started to become elected into state legislatures and even Congress. Even in South Carolina, the state legislature was not controlled by mostly whites. It was actually pretty equitable. And with that, we were able to see massive improvement where public education was being offered to every child. There was an opening to public libraries and building hospitals and even more. And this was because after getting the right to vote, those previously enslaved used their voting power and made sure that their voices were heard. This was also due because many southern states were subject to martial law. The state constitutions had to be changed, and federal troops were there to ensure that federal law was followed, and that they were following these 3 amendments. There was also even a Freemen's Bureau that helped those recently enslaved, sort of like a refugee, in assisting housing, education, and even finance. So there was a bureau to be able to assist those, locate housing, open up banks, and be able to reintegrate into society after recently being enslaved. And so for a short period, a very short period of time, it was getting better. Black people were attending colleges, they were becoming scientists, lawyers, and even legislators. And this was contributed to the amendments and to increasing the access to voting. But then in 1877, federal troops are removed from the Deep South and we transition into Jim Crow era. I know many of you already know about this era and how it allowed, states to segregate schools and hospitals, and it increased voter disenfranchisement with poll taxes, literacy tests, vagrancy laws, all of that. And so it was from this point in history to 1965 that the voter turnout for Black people were dismal and measly. There were some states and counties in Alabama that they had 3% of the Black voter turnout. Some counties might not even have 1 Black person turn out to vote. And as well, what they were also facing is that they were not able to access adequate education, housing, healthcare as United States citizens. And so if we fast forward to the civil rights movement, we then see that the United States passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based off of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. This is just a repeat of the 14th Amendment that states that any person has equal protection of laws. So it's almost like there had to be a reminder of the 14th Amendment or reinforce the 14th Amendment with the Civil Rights Act, that we are equal and then we should not be discriminated. And so then a year after that, there's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this prohibited racial discrimination with voting. But this was explicitly to reinforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution that was signed into law 95 years earlier. And so this, with the 15th Amendment, it expanded where there was a key provision in the Voting Rights Act that certain states, specifically states in the South, had to request with the Attorney General on any new state law or local law to ensure that they did not prevent Black people to vote, prevent Black people to exercise their vote. And then again, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act worked. It increased voter turnout with Black Americans and other disproportionate people who are affected by voting, such as Hispanics and even Native Americans who didn't get the right to vote until 1971. But it expanded the voter turnout to everyone, and it even led us to elect our first Black president. And there was still high, disenfranchisement with those with criminal history, with many who have a felony on their record not be able to vote. But it was more beneficial than prior to the Voting Rights Act, specifically with this provision that certain states, specifically southern states, but it expanded to others like Arizona, to be able, they had to request to the Attorney General what their new state law was going to be, and they would have to determine if it would prevent Black people or any other person off of the race or color the right to vote or exercise their vote. And so it was working. Voting Rights Act kept intact with many, many states had to get approval from the Attorney General until 2013 with a major Supreme Court case that's called Shelby County v. Holder. And in this Supreme Court decision, it was determined that that key provision that the states had to ask the Attorney General about their specific laws was deemed unconstitutional and was struck from the Voting Rights Act. And we specifically do not have that provision of the states requesting the new changes with the Attorney General. And so this almost instantly, made it back that we have almost the similar state laws prior to the Voting Rights Act and during that Jim Crow era, where we see voter ID laws, and then also a huge topic that we hear today about not allowing absentee ballots for certain voters. And so this is the reason why I mentioned the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and then the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, because it shows that we have had to fight for voting rights from the very beginning, from the moment when Black people gained their freedom and were no longer enslaved, fought for their freedom. We had to fight for our right to vote then, and we continue to have to fight for our vote because we have a voice behind our ballot, and it has been able to make some very progressive changes. And so it is time now that we reclaim our vote, because our vote is our power. With our vote, we've created public education, public libraries, and more from gaining that right to vote. Also, this history shows how powerful our vote is, because many are trying so hard to not allow us the right to vote. They have tried so hard to dilute our power, but we are fighting harder and the fight continues. We will reclaim our vote because our vote is our power. We must continue our protests to the polls. So yeah, we need to just, this is going to be a continual fight. It's almost where we're seeing a lot of the same things with Jim Crow laws now that we saw in that time period. And it's only been 7 years since that decision has passed. So it's almost like we're fighting again for our right to vote and reclaiming that vote. And so before I open up for questions, I wanted to make sure that we all know where we currently are at in Washington State with the voting process, and make sure that I answer or hit upon any sort of frequently asked questions that I've been hearing at this time. And so the first, I wanted to make sure and people know that if you have a criminal history, you can vote in Washington after you leave DOC custody. So if you're not under DOC custody, you can register to vote. And if you don't know that, contact DOC, but usually usually you would know. But so if you have a criminal history, once you're from DOC, you can vote. From now until election day, you can register to vote, but you have to do it in person. And you're able to do this all the way until election day. So from now until election day, you have to do it in person, and you can do that at your county's elections office or the voting center. Most of the people here are probably from King County, so the elections office is in Renton. There's going to be a voting center at CenturyLink Field. And so the last couple of things I wanted to mention, especially because of currently what's happening right now with the Postal Service, is if you have your ballot and you haven't turned it in, if you want to do it by mail, make sure you do it no later than this Friday. If you do it after Friday, the best way to do it is to drop it off at a local drop box. You can there's over 70 drop boxes in King County, and you can put it in a drop box all the way until 8 p.m. on election day. So those are your options to register to vote now and to turn in your ballot now. If you cannot locate your ballot, or if you lost it in any way, you can print off a new ballot at votewa.gov. Votewa.gov. And if you need any assistance with completing your ballot, I created a first-time voter guide on our website at urbanleague.org. And it will tell you all the things you need to know to make sure you complete your ballot correctly and confidently. We don't tell you who to vote for, but just how to do it correctly. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for having me. I really hope it was insightful, but I will open up the floor with questions.
So if anyone has any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or make a comment.
I see one in the chat. Is it possible for a person to both believe in systemic racism and support Trump? I think to me that's a tricky question, because with that voter, I don't know completely why they're supporting Trump, and so, but there is many things that he stated, even saying that Seattle is an anarchist jurisdiction, and he might use that in terms of different relief packages or funding opportunities for jurisdictions that can be sort of tricky for someone who might need access to quality healthcare or education for their kids. So I would want to know more in terms of why that person supported Trump and what they do and believe in systemic racism. But yeah, that's my answer to that question. The next question I have is, any thoughts on defunding the police? So my thoughts is I believe that, and I believe that even the police would agree that they're over capacity. They are, the ones that we call when there's a mental health crisis, the ones that we call when there's a domestic violence dispute, when we lock our keys out of the car, out of our house sometimes, or locksmith, or we have, we rely on the police for so many different things that I think what it needs to happen is we need to rethink on what that looks like. And I've seen some places where now they're thinking about, allocating more funds to the firefighters, so they would have somebody who's like a mental health provider, and they would take the call rather than the police department, or any sort of some dispute, and they don't want the police to be involved, but they still want it to be solved. There could be like a community hotline number for them to work it out within community, and I think another thing is, we're really wanting police to be held accountable. And so I think looking at it from the flip side and making sure that if anything does go wrong, if excessive force is used, if misconduct does occur, something will happen when that happens. And so I think one is that they're just very overworked, and then two, we're really just wanting accountability. Next question is, voter turnout is expected to be 90%. Amazing. Do you know the percentage of expected Black voter count in Washington and King County? Good question. That's a really hard question to be able to determine, because we do not ask race on their ballot. So that you can sort of try to find out that data. Some people try to figure out with overlapping zip codes and voter data, but usually it's around 40% with that matching data. It's not completely accurate, but hopefully it will be more. And that's sort of, someone mentioned the community service officers program, and that they got rid of in 2004, and how it was really effective. And that's sort of where I'm at in terms of the concept of defunding the police. I think, that is exactly one type of program that I think would be necessary now. Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, so someone asked, what can Congress do in response to the Supreme Court decision regarding the Voting Rights Act? They would have to be able to create they could be able to create a new law. But what could happen is similar to what happened with the Voting Rights Act, is it could be challenged that it's unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Shelby County v. Holder was their attorney general, so they were suing their attorney general off of his decision. If they had something very similar where this request process that needed to occur, it could be a law that's enacted, but it could follow the same trap of being having decided by the Supreme Court in terms of the constitutionality of it. Do you feel like the Democratic Party went far enough to include Black and Brown people's issues this year? I think we will just need to continue to fight. And what I think we need to make sure is that we lobby our senators and House of Representatives and make sure that what we want happens, and we continue the conversation after the election, as well as next year we have another very important election where we now go back to very local politics, and what you want to make sure happens on a city and county level will happen next year. So my hope is that with this huge resurgence of people, interested in voting and really paying attention to the election, that we just continue the conversation and making sure people's voices are heard. So the next question is, I know that teens can pre-register to vote, but I have noticed a lot of disillusion in the current political system among younger votes. Any thoughts on how young voters are getting engaged in King County? Yes, I have been talking to a lot of youth on their thoughts about the election. And one thing that I would say is that I believe that the next generation is more issue focused than party focused. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that's going to morph with, deciding candidates and moving forward. But, and so with that being said, I think, they want to vote and they understand the importance of it and understand that their voices matter, but they want to make sure that who they're voting for is going to meet exactly what their issues are, and almost all of the issues that they face. So I think that is the main thing that I've seen. Do you think there will be civil unrest after the election, regardless of who is elected next week? I believe that there will be, so I do believe that there's going to be civil unrest, but there's going to be key states that can't open ballots until on election day. So it could be where we don't know until maybe a couple of days after. But I think it's so divisive right now that I could see it happening, but I'm also really, really hopeful because it's been able to get people out into the election. I mean, we've had more people coming out to elections than ever before. So I'm really focusing on the hope that this is just going to be the continuing of the conversation, and we really get people not only to the polls, but talk to their legislatures. But I can see civil unrest happening, but hopefully for not very long. Do you think there is any chance that we could not have every police officer carrying a gun? Yes, and this goes back to, where I believe that we just call police officers for everything, and we need to rethink what that looks like. And that's why there's, some jurisdictions that are looking at having more of the firefighters go answer some of these like mental health calls or other calls because they don't have guns. And so, and I believe in the community policing that happened in 2004, they didn't have guns as well. So I think there can be a way, and this is again the conversation on, having more than one option than a police officer would be a way that we could have it with they're not carrying a gun. Yeah, awesome. And then someone said something about a Black Gems Caucus group, and then they meet online on Thursdays at 5. Any other questions?
Any closing comments from any of the audience members? Well, thank you so much, Maya. That was really informative. And
I just want to say one thing. Yeah, just really nice job. And I was just perusing Facebook. Patrice Cullors was supposed to speak on something tonight, and I got so many different text things that I'm doing, Working Families Party, the Dems, everything. I need to make phone calls now for an hour. But
it's a busy time for everybody.
I was actually in a class with 14 teenagers this afternoon, and we actually did a whole thing on just basically anti-bias work, and how we keep it going, and it is hopeful. They don't really feel like it's as much of a problem as I do. I know my son doesn't feel like it's as much as a problem as I do, but I'm holding the hope for the young people. So thanks for offering this.
Me too. Yeah. They give me hope as well. And another thing that is really astonishing is that they're not really taught civic education in high school. So That's a huge barrier that I've been finding in terms of them understanding down the ballot, where they only really understand that they vote for the President of the United States, but they don't know the other key positions like the Attorney General, Governor, even Lieutenant Governor. So that's also been a barrier that I've found this election cycle. But yeah, I hope we leave on a hopeful note. I've been hearing more people than not, saying, have you voted, or I've already voted, or I've completed my ballot. There's just been so many resurgence of making sure that our voice is heard. So I really hope that, I'm pretty sure everybody on this call has voted or is going to, but make sure that you let, 5 friends and family members also know that, their vote matters, especially the young ones, especially the first time voters, because they might be a little wary. So definitely check in on them. But thank you all so much for having me.